This is part number 67, Preparation for Exam NSE4 Fortinet, Firewall Policy, Source. A firewall policy consists of access and inspection rules, like a set of instructions that tell FortiGate how to handle traffic on the interface whose traffic they filter. After the user makes an initial connection attempt, FortiGate checks the firewall policies to determine whether to accept or deny the communication session. Firewall policies can use user and user group objects to define the source. The objects include local firewall accounts, external or remote server accounts, PKI public key infrastructure certificate users, FSSO users, Fortinet single sign-on users. After the user makes an initial connection attempt, FortiGate checks the firewall policies and decides if we need to accept this session. However, a firewall policy also includes a number of other instructions, such as those dealing with authentication. We can use the source of a firewall policy for this purpose. The source of a firewall policy must include the source address or IP address, but we also need to include the user and user group. In this way, any user or user group that is included in the source definition for the firewall policy can successfully authenticate. User and user group objects can consist of local firewall accounts, external server accounts, PKI users, and FSSO users. And anyone who belongs to the group and provides correct information will have the successful authentication. Firewall policy also checks the service in order to transport the named protocols or group of protocols. No service, with the exception of DNS, domain name service, is allowed through the firewall policy before successful user authentication. DNS, domain name service, is usually used by HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, so that people can use domain names for websites instead of their IP addresses. DNS is allowed because it's a base protocol and will most likely be required to initially see proper authentication protocol traffic. Host name resolution is almost always a requirement for any protocol. However, the domain name services must still be defined in the policy as allowed in order for it to pass. Hostname resolution is often required by application layer protocol such as HTTP, HTTPS, Hypertext Transfer Protocol and Protocol Secure version, FTP File Transfer Protocol, and Telnet. Application layer protocols require hostname resolution that is used to authenticate. DNS service must be explicitly listed as service in the policy. For example, we go to Policies and Objects and then go to Firewall Policy. And here we can put full access, which allows users to use external DNS servers in order to resolve host names before successful authentication. DNS is also allowed if authentication is unsuccessful, because users need to be able to try to authenticate again. Any service that includes domain name service would function the same way like the default all service. HTTP service is TCP port 80 and does not include DNS. DNSs which use ports 53, TCP and UDP. Protocols. A firewall policy must allow a protocol in order to show authentication dialog that is used in active authentication. HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, Telnet. If the firewall policy that has authentication enabled does not allow at least one of the supported protocols which are used for obtaining user credentials, the user will not be able to authenticate. Protocols are required for all authentication methods that use active authentication. 3 types of active authentication methods: local password authentication, remote password authentication, or server-based password authentication, and two-factor authentication. Active authentication prompts the user for user credentials based on the following: the protocol of the traffic and the firewall policy. Passive authentication, on the other hand, determines the user identity behind the scenes and does not require any specific services to be allowed within the policy. All other services except HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, and Telnet are not allowed until the user has authenticated successfully through one of the protocols listed. Mixing policies. For example, enabling authentication on policy does not always force an active authentication prompt. For example, we have policy IDs 17, 18, and 19. Policy 17 is for local subnet guest group, guest AV certificate inspection, and contractor group local subnet, contractor AV, and certificate inspection. Both of them, their status is accept and they are enabled. And policy sequence number 17 looks for both IP and user group information, local subnet and guest user respectively. And since the user has not yet authenticated, the user group aspect of the traffic does not match. Since the policy match is not complete, FortiGate continues its search down the sequence list to see if there is a complete match. Next, FortiGate evaluates policy sequence number 18 to see if the traffic matches. It will not for the same reason, and it didn't match the policy number 17. Finally, FortiGate evaluates policy sequence 19, which is local subnet default certificate inspection except enabled, and to see if traffic matches. It matches all criteria, so traffic is allowed with no need to authenticate. When we use only active authentication, if all possible policies that could match the source IP have authentication enabled, then the user will receive a login prompt, assuming they use an acceptable login protocol. In other words, if policy sequence 19 also had authentication enabled, the users would receive login prompts. If we use passive authentication, it can successfully obtain user details when traffic from local _subnet with users that belong to guest group will apply to policy sequence 17, even though policy sequence 19 does not have authentication enabled. If we use both active and passive authentication, and FortiGate can identify a user's credentials through passive authentication, the user never receives a login prompt, regardless of the order of any firewall policies. This is because there is no need for FortiGate to prompt the user for login credentials when it can identify who the user is passively. When we combine active and passive authentication methods, active authentication is intended to be used as a backup, so be used only when passive authentication fails. Active authentication behavior. There are three different ways how we can alter active authentication behavior. If we have an active authentication firewall policy allowed by fall-through policy that does not have authentication enabled on it, then all traffic will use the fall-through policy. This means that users are not asked to authenticate. By default, all traffic passes through the catch-all policy without being authenticated. We can alter this behavior by enabling authentication on all firewall policies. When we enable authentication, all the systems must authenticate before traffic is placed on the egress interface. Alternatively, only on command line interface we can change the auth on demand parameters options to always. We do it by typing config user setting set auth-on-demand, then we put option always or implicit. Implicit is default option. It will not trigger authentication if there is a fall-through policy. And always it triggers authentication prompt through policies that have active authentication enabled regardless if there is a fall-through policy. So we put auth on demand always. This instructs FortiGate to trigger an authentication request if there is a firewall policy with active authentication enabled. And in this case, the traffic is allowed until authentication is successful. If we want to have all users connect to a specific interface, then it is better to enable captive portal authentication at the interface level. This way, all devices must authenticate before they are allowed to access any resources. Authentication timeout. We can configure authentication timeout using command line interface config user setting set auth-timeout -type, and here we can choose one of three types: idle timeout, hard timeout, or new session. An authentication timeout is used for security purposes. It minimizes the risk of someone using the IP of the legitimate authenticated user. It also ensures users do not authenticate and then stay in memory indefinitely. If users stayed in memory forever, it would eventually lead to memory exhaustion. There are three options for timeout behavior. Idle timeout looks for the packet from the host IP. If there are no packets generated by the host service in the configured time frame, then the user is logged out. Hard timeout is an absolute value. Regardless of the user's behavior, the timer starts as soon as the user authenticates and express after the configured value. It expires after time which is defined in this command. And new session. Even if traffic is being generated on existing communications channels, the authentication expires if no new sessions are created through the firewall from the host device within the configured timeout value. We need to choose the type of timeout that best suits the authentication needs for our environment. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. We will talk about monitoring users. Thank you.